Henry Dawson planted his boots in the red Arizona dust and did not move. He stood at the gate of Alma Alden's property like a man who had been nailed there by God himself, his long coat pushed back on both sides to expose the twin Colt revolvers riding low on his hips. His jaw was set, his dark eyes sweeping the road with the cold precision of a man who had spent 15 years reading the difference between a traveler and a threat. 3 riders had stopped 20 yards back, their horses shifting and stamping, sensing what their riders were only beginning to understand. "Step aside, stranger," the one in front called out. His name was Cord Beaumont, and everyone in Ridgeline County knew it. He wore a silver-tipped hat and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "That woman inside owes Mr. Harlan a debt, and we are here to collect." Henry's voice came out low and even, carrying across the distance without effort, the way a rifle shot carries without needing to shout. "The next man who rides through this gate," he said, "answers to me." Cord's smile flickered. The rider on his left reached for his sidearm. Henry's hand moved so fast that none of them truly saw it happen. And then the rider was staring at the barrel of a Colt Navy revolver that had appeared from nowhere, aimed directly between his eyes. "I would think on that very carefully before you finish that motion," Henry said. Nobody moved. The wind pushed a cloud of dust between them like a curtain, and then Cord pulled his horse around without another word, and the 3 of them rode back toward town at a pace that was not quite running but was close enough. Henry holstered his revolver slowly. He did not turn around for a long moment, and when he did, Alma Alden was standing on her porch with her arms folded across her chest and her dark brown eyes fixed on him with an expression that was equal parts fury and something else she had not yet found a name for. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "No," Henry agreed, walking back toward the gate and latching it. "You did not." That was the moment, standing in the Arizona heat with the dust still settling and the echo of hoofbeats fading, that both of them felt the first tremor of something dangerous beginning between them. Neither of them was the kind of person who had ever wanted to feel it. Both of them were going to feel it anyway. To understand how Henry Dawson came to be standing at Alma Alden's gate, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the day he rode into Ridgeline with nothing but a saddlebag, a bedroll, and a reputation that had preceded him by about 4 counties. It was the summer of 1877, and the Arizona Territory was not yet a state and might never become one if the men currently running it had anything to say about the matter. The town of Ridgeline sat at the edge of a high plateau, red and brown and dusty, with a main street that had 6 saloons, 2 churches, 1 doctor's office, and a sheriff whose primary occupation seemed to be keeping out of the way of the man who actually ran the county. That man was Preston Harlan. Harlan had come to Ridgeline in 1869 with a cattle operation and a lawyer, 2 things that in the Arizona Territory were more powerful than 100 guns. He had bought up grazing land, water rights, and debts, and he had quietly arranged the removal of anyone who stood in the way of his expansion. Not always with violence, because Preston Harlan was too clever for unnecessary violence. He used contracts. He used debt. He used the kind of slow, grinding pressure that eventually broke a person down without leaving visible marks. He had been using all 3 on Alma Alden for the better part of 2 years. Alma had come to the territory 6 years earlier with her late husband, Thomas Alden, who had staked a claim on a piece of land that sat at the junction of 2 creek beds, making it some of the most reliably watered ground in the whole region. Thomas had been a good man and a hard worker, and in 1875 a fever had taken him in the space of 11 days, leaving Alma alone with 160 acres, 2 hired hands, a small cattle herd, and a debt to the Ridgeline Bank that she had been methodically paying down ever since. The bank was owned by Preston Harlan. Twice he had sent men to offer her a fair price for the property. Twice she had declined. The 3rd time, the offer had stopped being entirely an offer, and Alma had understood that she was in a different kind of trouble now, the kind that did not resolve itself with hard work and careful budgeting, the kind that wore silver-tipped hats and smiled without warmth. Henry Dawson had arrived in Ridgeline on a Monday morning, and he had not arrived with any intention of staying. He was passing through on his way to Tucson, where a man named Willard Cross had contacted him through an intermediary about a security position for a mining company. Henry had spent 15 years bouncing between legitimate employment and the kind of work that sat in the gray area near it, serving as a deputy in 2 different towns, working private security for a railroad for 3 years, and spending one dark winter as a hired gun that he did not discuss with anyone and that still showed up in his dreams with uncomfortable clarity. He was 34 years old, and he was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. He stopped in Ridgeline because his horse threw a shoe 2 miles outside of town, and he led the animal in on foot in the growing heat of the morning. He found the blacksmith, arranged for the work to be done, and walked to the nearest establishment that served coffee, which turned out to be a small restaurant run by a Mexican woman named Senora Vargas, who made the best coffee Henry had tasted in 3 years, and whose establishment had the additional advantage of a view of the main street through a wide front window. It was while he was sitting at that window, drinking his second cup, that he first saw Alma Alden. She came down the main street in a wagon with the quiet, deliberate pace of a woman who knew where she was going and did not intend to be distracted from it. She was dressed practically, in a dark blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat against the sun, her dark hair pinned up neatly. She handled the reins with practiced ease, and she had a quality to her bearing that Henry noticed immediately, the quality of a person who was accustomed to standing alone in difficult situations and had decided long ago that this was simply the condition of her life. She stopped the wagon in front of the general store, tied the reins, and stepped down, and that was when 2 of Harlan's men intercepted her on the sidewalk. Henry knew men like that on sight. You could not spend 15 years in the work he had done without developing an eye for them. They were not dangerous in the way that truly dangerous men were. They were the kind that derived their courage entirely from the certainty that no one would stop them, from the implicit threat of the organization behind them. One of them put his hand on the wagon handle to block her way, and Henry watched Alma Alden look at that hand with an expression that could have frozen water, and then look up at the man's face with the same expression and not move 1 inch. "Mr. Harlan says to remind you that the payment was due Friday," the man said. "I am aware of when my payment was due," Alma replied. "I also know that I made it and that the receipt is in my possession, if you will excuse me." She moved around the hand on the wagon without touching it and went into the general store. The 2 men looked at each other and then moved off, but Henry had seen the way they looked back at the store, and he had seen the way one of them took note of her wagon and her horse with the specific, calculating attention of a man cataloging assets. He did not consciously decide to do anything about it. He finished his coffee, paid Senora Vargas, and checked on his horse at the blacksmith's, where he learned the work would not be done until late afternoon. He ate lunch at the same restaurant, asked Senora Vargas with the casualness of a man making idle conversation about the general character of the town, and learned rather a great deal in 40 minutes. He learned about Thomas Alden's death and the creekbed property. He learned about Preston Harlan and his bank and his slow campaign to acquire that property. He learned that the sheriff, a man named Oral, was not in anyone's pocket precisely, but was committed above all else to his own continued survival, which amounted to approximately the same thing. He learned that Alma Alden had no family in the territory, that her 2 hired hands had left in the spring after Harlan's men had made their situations uncomfortable, and that she had been managing alone since then. "She is a very stubborn woman," Senora Vargas said, and the way she said it was absolutely an expression of admiration. Henry rode out of Ridgeline late that afternoon, his horse rishad and the road to Tucson stretching out ahead of him. He got about 4 miles. He sat on his horse in the long evening light, the red cliffs turning gold on either side of the road, and he thought about the expression on Alma Alden's face when she had looked at that man's hand on her wagon. He thought about the way Harlan's men had catalogued her property. He thought about a woman alone on 160 acres, with no one between her and the kind of pressure that did not stop until it got what it wanted. He thought about the fact that he had a job waiting in Tucson and absolutely no obligation to anyone in Ridgeline, and that getting involved in someone else's fight had never once in his life produced a good outcome. Then he turned his horse around. He did not entirely understand why, not that first evening. He told himself it was because he had heard of Preston Harlan before, in connection with some business that had happened up near Prescott, and that there was a professional satisfaction in the idea of putting an obstacle in Harlan's way. He told himself it was because he was tired of riding toward things, and that riding away from one was a kind of rest. He found a campsite a mile from the Alden property and slept under the stars with his saddle for a pillow, and in the morning he rode to her gate. Alma Alden came out of her house when she heard the horse, and she stood on her porch in the same practical attitude he had noted the day before, except that her expression was considerably less contained. "What do you want?" she called. "My name is Henry Dawson," he said. "I am passing through your area and wondered if you might have work that needed doing. I am useful with fence posts and cattle." "I know who you are," she said, and he was briefly surprised. "Senora Vargas sent word this morning." She said a quiet man with a reputation had been asking about my situation and had ridden back this direction instead of on to Tucson. Henry appreciated, not for the first time, the efficiency of information in small communities. "Then you know I am not dangerous to you," he said. "I know no such thing," she said. "Get off your horse and state your actual business plainly or ride on." He got off his horse. They talked for an hour on her porch, which was not a comfortable conversation by any measure. Alma was direct in the manner of a woman who had learned that oblique communication was a luxury she could not afford, and she asked him questions that he found uncomfortable, not because they were hostile, but because they required honest answers. She asked why he had turned around. She asked what he expected in return. She asked whether he was a man who could be paid off by Harlan, and whether the offer of that possibility had already been made. To the last question, he said that Harlan's men had not yet had occasion to make any offer, but that when they did, his answer would be no, because he did not work for men like Harlan. "Why not?" she asked. "Because I have worked for men like Harlan," he said, "once, and I did not like what I became for a period of time afterward." Something shifted in her expression at that, not softening exactly, but becoming more calibrated, as if she were measuring him against a standard that had just been adjusted. She hired him, not as a gun hand, which she made explicitly clear, but as a ranch hand to help with the work that had gone undone since her hired men had left. She offered him wages that were fair and a place in the small bunkhouse that Thomas had built his first year on the property. She did not offer friendship or anything resembling it, and he did not ask for either. The first week was entirely practical. Henry repaired fence line, checked water flow in the creek channels, did an inventory of her cattle, and found 2 calves that had wandered into a gully and extracted them with considerable effort. He was a competent ranch hand, which surprised Alma somewhat, because most men with his particular type of reputation were specialists in one kind of work only. "Where did you learn cattle?" she asked one evening when she brought out coffee and found him checking over the fence work he had done that day. "Texas," he said, "before other things." She waited, and he understood that the wait was an invitation to elaborate if he chose, not a demand. "I grew up on a ranch in East Texas," he said. "My father and 2 older brothers still run it. I left when I was 19. There was a man who needed to answer for something, and when it was done, going back did not feel right, and I found other work, and then more other work, and 15 years passed." "The man," she said. "The one who needed to answer for something." "He hurt my mother," Henry said, in a tone that communicated the full extent of what that meant without requiring further elaboration. Alma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did he answer?" "He did." She nodded once, in the manner of a woman who had asked a question she considered important and received an acceptable reply. She took the empty coffee cup back inside, and that was that. But something had changed in the way she looked at him after that evening. It was subtle, and she was clearly committed to keeping it that way. But Henry noticed things. It was what had kept him alive through 15 years of complicated work, and he noticed the way her eyes held his fractionally longer than before. He noticed that when she passed him in the course of the day's work, she maintained precisely the same physical distance she always had, which told him she was paying attention to that distance, and that the distance was a choice. He did not press it. He went about his work. The trouble escalated in the second week. Cord Beaumont and his two companions rode out to the property on a Tuesday afternoon with a letter from the Ridgeline Bank. The letter was a legal document, drafted by Harlan's lawyer, that claimed Alma's last payment had not been received, and that therefore she was in arrears by 1 month, which, per the terms of the loan, gave the bank the right to demand the full outstanding balance within 30 days or proceed with foreclosure. Alma read the letter on her porch with Henry standing at the bottom of the steps. Her face was controlled, but he watched her hands grip the paper too tightly and understood the effort it was taking. "I have the receipt," she said. "Mr. Harlan is not aware of any receipt," Cord said pleasantly. "That is because Mr. Harlan is lying," Alma said. The pleasantness in Cord's expression did not change, but something behind it went cold. "Mrs. Alden, you would be wise to think carefully about accusations of that nature." "I will be in Ridgeline on Thursday with my receipt and my attorney," Alma said, and Henry noted that the clarity and steadiness of her voice was a kind of courage that deserved recognition. "The nearest attorney is in Tucson," Cord said. "I am aware of that as well," she said. "Thursday. Good day." After they left, she stood on the porch for a long moment without moving, and Henry let the silence hold because he understood that she needed it too. Then she said, quietly, "My attorney in Tucson is Robert Finch. We have corresponded by letter, but he has never been here. The cost of bringing him to Ridgeline will be significant. Can you manage it?" "I will have to," she said. "If Harlan's claim gets any legal traction, even false legal traction, the situation becomes immeasurably more complicated." She looked at him. "I suppose you have experience with men who operate through legal mechanisms rather than outright force." "Harlan's type is more dangerous than the other kind," Henry said, "because they can make what they are doing look legitimate while they are doing it. The key is to meet them in their own arena while simultaneously making clear that the other arena remains available." She studied him. "You mean make him understand that there will be consequences even if the law runs his way?" "I mean exactly that." She was quiet again for a moment. Then, in a careful voice, "Henry, I hired you to work cattle. I did not hire you to put yourself between me and men who will harm you for it." "I know that," he said. "Then I am asking you, as a matter of clarity between us, to understand that whatever you are doing it by your own choice and not on my behalf." "Understood," he said. She held his gaze for 1 moment longer than strictly necessary. Then she went inside to write a letter to Robert Finch in Tucson. It was on Thursday morning, when Cord Beaumont and his men rode back to the property unexpectedly, before Alma had left for Ridgeline, that Henry stepped out to the gate and made the declaration that changed everything. He had been up before dawn, aware in the particular way of experienced men that something was being planned. He had checked his revolvers in the pale gray light and walked the perimeter of the property and positioned himself at the gate when he heard horses coming down the road. He counted 3, recognized the lead horse, and understood that Cord Beaumont had decided to move from the phase of legal pressure to the phase of direct intimidation, and that this was the moment. After the riders departed and Alma made her comment about not having asked for his help, Henry walked up to the porch and looked at her directly. "They were not coming to deliver another letter this time," he said. She met his eyes without flinching. She knew it too. What do you think they intended? Scare you badly enough that you sign a voluntary sale before your attorney arrives. Maybe damage something. Maybe worse than that. He said the last part carefully, not wanting to be dramatic about it, just honest. Alma Alden looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that seemed to process information in a way that was almost visible, layer by layer, sorting it and categorizing it with the precision of a woman who had learned to trust nothing she had not personally examined. "You could have been killed," she said at last. "Yes," he said, "for someone you have known for 10 days. Yes." She turned and went inside without another word. He stood on the porch for a moment, listening to her move through the house, and then walked back to the bunkhouse to begin the day's work. She came to the bunkhouse door an hour later with breakfast, which she had never done before, having previously left food for him in the kitchen when he came in for meals. She set the plate on the small table inside without comment and turned to go, and then stopped in the doorway. "Why?" she asked, not confrontationally, simply. He thought about it carefully before he answered. "Because you are facing something that cannot be faced alone, and I find that I am not able to ride past that kind of situation anymore without involving myself in it. That is a general reason," she said. "I am asking for the specific one." He met her eyes. "Because it is you," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. She looked at him for a moment that stretched out until it had its own particular character, its own specific quality of suspended time, and then she nodded once slowly and went back to the house. Henry ate breakfast alone and then went out to fix the northern fence line, and he did not examine too closely what had just happened between them because examining it too closely felt like it might make it collapse under scrutiny. They drove to Ridgeline together in her wagon that afternoon. Henry rode alongside on his horse, and they spoke little on the way in, but the quality of the silence was different than it had been. Less guarded, more like the comfortable quiet of people who have arrived at an understanding without having negotiated it explicitly. At the Ridgeline Bank, Alma presented her payment receipt to the bank manager, a nervous man named Pemberton who was visibly unhappy to be caught in the middle of whatever was happening. He examined the receipt and then examined it again, and then looked at the ledger, and then looked at Henry Dawson standing quietly near the door, and the ledger suddenly produced an entry that had apparently been overlooked. "It seems," Pemberton said, with the expression of a man diffusing a device of uncertain volatility, "that there may have been an error in the accounting." "Is my account in good standing?" Alma asked. "It appears to be," he said. "I would like that confirmed in writing," she said. "Today." She received a letter on bank stationery confirming the good standing of her account, signed by Pemberton and witnessed by Henry, and she folded it and placed it in her bag with the careful deliberateness of a woman securing an important weapon. On the way home, when they were clear of town and the road ran through a stretch of high scrubland with the late sun painting the rocks orange and red, she said, "He will try something else." "Yes," Henry said. "He is not the kind of man who accepts defeat from a circumstance like this. The bank approach failed. He will find another angle." "What does he want the land for specifically?" Henry asked. He had been thinking about this. Harlan had substantial landholdings already. 160 acres of Alden Creekbed property was valuable but not extraordinarily so, not enough to justify this level of sustained pressure. Alma was quiet for a moment. "Thomas thought it was the water access," she said. "Our creek channel connects to the main watershed in a way that would allow whoever controls it to manage flow to the southern grazing lands. Harlan's southern grazing lands specifically. So it is not about the land itself. It is about the water rights that come with the land." "Exactly. With control of my creek channels, Harlan could effectively decide how much water the 3 properties south of mine receive, which would put those landowners entirely at his mercy." Henry thought about that. "Then those 3 landowners have a stake in what happens to your property." She glanced at him sidelong. He saw the moment she understood what he was suggesting. "I have not had any contact with them," she said. That might be worth changing. She considered this with the focused attention she brought to every practical problem. Fletcher Dodd runs the closest of the three. He is a cautious man. The other two are the Ray's family and old Tom Garrett, who I believe is rather more willing to make his opinions known. Start with Garrett, Henry said. She almost smiled. It was a slight thing, barely a curve at the corner of her mouth, but he had been paying close enough attention to recognize it, and it did something complicated and significant to the region of his chest. They found Robert Finch's reply from Tucson waiting at the Ridgeline Post Office on Friday. He could come the following week, he wrote, and he had some thoughts about the situation that he believed would be useful, having dealt with similar circumstances in his practice before. The cost of his travel and service was stated plainly, and it was steep. Alma read the letter in the wagon on the way back to the property. Henry watched her calculate. "I can manage it," she said finally, with the tone of a woman who has managed things that were harder than this and intends to keep managing them. "You do not have to do it alone," he said, and immediately understood from her expression that he had chosen the wrong words, or at least words that carried a weight she was not ready for. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "I have been managing alone for 2 years. It is not a complaint, it is simply my situation." "I know that," he said. "I am not suggesting that you cannot. I am suggesting that you do not have to." She held the letter in her lap and looked at the road ahead. "You have a job waiting in Tucson," she said. "I do. When this is settled, you will go." He did not answer immediately, which was an answer of its own kind. "I have not decided what I will do when this is settled," he said honestly. She looked at him then, and the openness of that look was something he had not seen in her before, a brief, unguarded moment in which whatever she was thinking was close enough to the surface that he could almost read it. Then she looked back at the road. "We should visit Tom Garrett tomorrow," she said. Tom Garrett turned out to be a man of 72 who had been in the Arizona Territory since before it was officially organized, who had opinions about Preston Harlan that could strip paint, and who had been waiting for someone to give him an occasion to express those opinions in a coordinated manner since the spring of 1875. He welcomed Alma and Henry into his house with the enthusiasm of a man who has been sitting alone with useful information for too long. "Harlan has been trying to buy me out for 3 years," Garrett said, pouring coffee from a battered pot with the decisive manner of a man who did everything decisively. "I have told him each time that I would sooner give my land to the Apache, which is not a serious offer, mind you, just a statement of comparative preference." Alma laid out the situation clearly. The water rights, the creek channels, the legal pressure being applied to her property, and the theory that her land was the key piece that would give Harlan control of the watershed. Garrett listened with his full attention, which at 72 was still considerable. When she finished, he said, "And you want us to present a united front. I want you to understand what is at stake for all of us," she said. "What you choose to do with that information is your own affair." "Diplomatically put," Garrett said. He looked at Henry. "And you are ranch hand," Henry said. Garrett looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating gaze of a man who had read a great many ranch hands in 72 years and was reading this one carefully. He said, he looked back at Alma. "I will talk to Dodd. The Ray's family, their eldest boy Miguel knows what is what, and he has more spine than his father. Give me 3 days." Outside, walking back to the wagon, Alma said quietly, "That went better than I expected." "He has been waiting for this," Henry said. "He respects you," she said, "which is interesting, given that you said approximately 7 words in there. Some communication does not require words." She stepped up into the wagon and arranged the reins, and then looked down at him as he mounted his horse, and there was a quality to the way she looked at him that made him want to say something, though he could not have said clearly what. He settled for nothing, and they rode back in the late afternoon quiet. The week that followed was the most complicated, and in some ways the most significant of Henry Dawson's adult life, though he would not have been able to articulate exactly why while it was happening. On the surface, it was practical. Robert Finch arrived from Tucson, a methodical man in his 50s who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and whose quiet legal competence was the exact right instrument for the situation. He reviewed Alma's records, met with Tom Garrett, and drafted a letter to Preston Harlan's lawyer that laid out, with exceptional legal precision, the consequences of continued predatory pressure on Alma's property, including the potential for a formal legal complaint to the territorial governor's office regarding the bank's alleged false accounting. Harlan's lawyer, to no one's great surprise, responded within 24 hours with a letter that was considerably less belligerent than anything that had preceded it. But underneath the practical surface, something else was happening, and it was happening in the small spaces between the practical things. It was happening in the half hour after supper when Alma brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch, and they sat in the cooling dark and talked. They talked about Thomas, carefully at first, and then more openly, and Henry understood that Thomas Alden had been a good man and a loving husband, and that his loss had left a wound that had not fully closed. He did not try to minimize that. He simply listened. They talked about East Texas and his family's ranch and what it had been like to leave at 19. He found that he was telling her things he had not told anyone in a long time, not because she asked them out of him, but because in her presence the ordinary reluctance that governed him seemed to ease. On the 4th evening she asked him directly about the dark year, the one he never discussed. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the dark desert and the extraordinary density of stars above it. Then he said, "I took a job protecting a man who was doing harm to people for money. I did not know the full nature of the harm when I took the job, and by the time I understood it clearly, I had convinced myself that leaving would be a form of cowardice. That was a lie I told myself because the money was good and the alternative was uncertain. What changed? A woman," he said. "Not a romantic revelation, but a matter of fact. Not in the way you might think. A woman who was being hurt by the man I was protecting and who looked at me and asked me very simply why I was there. Not angrily, just honestly curious, and I could not answer her. 'What did you do?' 'I left,' he said, and reported what I knew to the territorial marshal. It did not make what I had participated in go away, but it ended it, which was worth something." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "Do you think people are defined by their worst choices?" "No," he said. "I think they are defined by what they choose afterward." She looked at him in the dark. He could see her face in the faint lantern light from the window, and what he saw there moved him in a way that was clean and real and frightening. "I agree with that," she said softly. He went to bed that night more unsettled than he had felt in a long time, which was not an unpleasant feeling, only an unfamiliar one. Harlan made his next move 8 days after Robert Finch's letter went out, and it was cleverer than Henry had anticipated, because Harlan, for all his predatory habits, was genuinely intelligent. He did not come after the property directly. He came after Henry. A man rode out to the property on a Wednesday morning and said his name was Carver, and that he was passing through from Prescott, and asked if he might water his horse at the creek. Alma said yes, because it was the decent thing, and while the horse drank, Carver made conversation with the easy manner of a traveling man, and in the course of this conversation mentioned that he had heard of a Henry Dawson who had done some work in Prescott 2 years back for a cattleman named Rogan, and that this Henry Dawson was apparently wanted on a firearms charge in New Mexico territory. Alma listened to all of this with a perfectly neutral face and sent the man on his way. Then she went to find Henry. He was at the creek checking one of the channel diversions. She relayed what had been said without editorial comment, and he listened to all of it with his eyes on the water. "Is it true?" she asked. "The charge exists," he said. "It was filed by a man named Carruthers in Lincoln County 3 years ago after a dispute in which Carruthers drew on me first and discovered that this was an error. The territorial court in Santa Fe has the full account of the incident and has not pursued the matter. Whether that charge has been refreshed by someone willing to make Harlan a favor, I do not know. She looked at him steadily. So Harlan is now in possession of something he can use to have you removed, or to give you reason to remove me yourself, Henry said. The way she looked at him when he said that told him everything he needed to know about which direction her thinking had gone, and it settled something in him that had been uncertain. That man was sent by Harlan, she said, almost certainly. To plant doubt, she said. Yes. Well, she said after a moment, it did not work. He looked at her fully then, and she looked back with the quiet certainty of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. It did not, he agreed. She turned to go, then stopped. Then turned back, and what she did next surprised him entirely. She crossed the distance between them with 3 deliberate steps and put her hand on his arm, just briefly, just for a moment. A touch that was not an embrace or any conventional gesture of affection, but that carried more weight than either of those things by virtue of the fact that Alma Alden did not touch people casually. Then she withdrew her hand and walked back to the house, and Henry stood at the creek channel for a while longer, listening to the water run. 2 days later, Sheriff Orrell rode out to the property with a deputy and a piece of paper. The paper was a formal summons related to the New Mexico firearms charge, which had indeed been refreshed, by means Henry could not prove but understood clearly, and which required Henry to present himself at the Ridgeline Sheriff's office within 48 hours. Alma met Orrell on the porch with Robert Finch beside her, because Finch had not yet returned to Tucson, and this turned out to be important. Finch examined the summons with his methodical thoroughness, and then asked Orrell several questions about the nature of the communication received from New Mexico, the channel through which it had arrived, and the specific authority under which the Ridgeline Sheriff's Office was acting on a matter originating in another territory. Orrell, who was not unintelligent, visibly calculated the position he was in. He was caught between Harlan's interests, Finch's legal precision, and his own instinct for self-preservation, and his self-preservation instinct, which was the strongest of the 3, was telling him that this situation smelled wrong and that standing in the middle of it was going to be uncomfortable regardless of which direction he moved. "I will need to verify the origination of this document," Orrell said finally. "That seems prudent," Finch agreed. Orrell rode back to town. The summons was not acted upon. 2 weeks later, Finch received a communication from the Santa Fe court confirming that the Lincoln County charge had been reviewed and formally dismissed in light of the full record of the incident, and that no outstanding warrants existed for Henry Dawson anywhere in New Mexico territory. Harlan's gambit had failed. But it had accomplished one thing that Harlan had not intended, which was to make entirely clear to Alma Alden, in the specific way that crises clarify things, how she felt about Henry Dawson. The night after Orrell's visit, when Finch had retired to the small spare room Alma kept for guests, she came to the bunkhouse door. Henry was cleaning his revolvers by lantern light, the methodical process of it something he did when he needed to think, and he looked up when she knocked on the open door. She stood in the doorway with the night behind her and the lantern light catching the planes of her face, and she said, without preamble, "I need you to know something." He set down the cleaning cloth and gave her his full attention. "When Orrell came today," she said, "my first thought was not about the property or the water rights or Harlan's strategy. My first thought was about you, about what would happen to you." She paused. "I thought you should know that because I believe honesty between us is worth more than whatever composure I might preserve by not saying it." He stood up slowly, and the quality of the silence in the bunkhouse was the kind that had its own particular weight and texture, the silence of something important being held in suspension. "Alma," he said, "I am not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I know that you have a life elsewhere and that you came here by accident and that this situation will resolve one way or another. I simply thought, given what you said to me at the creek, that honesty deserved to be reciprocated." "What I said at the creek," he repeated. "That it is you," she said. "That was what you said, the specific reason." He crossed the bunkhouse in 4 steps and stood close enough to her that he could see the precise quality of the unguardedness she was allowing herself, which he understood was a significant and deliberate act for a woman of her particular character. "I am not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him very carefully. "The job in Tucson can wait," he said, "or can be declined. I have not decided which, but I know that the decision does not pull me toward Tucson. Where does it pull you?" She asked, and her voice had gone quieter, with the specific quality of someone asking a question they have needed to ask for a long time. He reached out and took her hand carefully, giving her every opportunity to decline the gesture. She did not decline it. "Here," he said simply. She stood very still for a moment, and then she pressed his hand briefly and withdrew from it, not in rejection, but in the manner of someone who is managing a significant emotion with great care. "Go to sleep," she said softly. "We have fence to check in the morning." He almost laughed. "Good night, Alma." She went back across the yard to the house, and Henry Dawson stood in the door of the bunkhouse for a long time, listening to the Arizona night, and feeling something in his chest that he had not felt in so long, that he had genuinely believed it was not something he was capable of anymore. Robert Finch left for Tucson on a bright Thursday morning, with a thoroughgoing set of legal documents in his case and a commitment to return if needed, though the assessment of both him and Alma was that the immediate crisis had largely been resolved. The bank had backed down, the legal maneuver had failed, and Harlan now knew that Alma was not standing alone. Harlan himself had not appeared in any of this. Men like Harlan did not appear. They sent instruments. But 1 week after Finch's departure, Preston Harlan appeared. He came alone, which was either confidence or calculation, and probably both. He was a man of 60, lean and well-dressed for the territory, with the cultivated manner of someone who had spent decades learning to project reasonableness and refinement. He knocked at the gate post and waited. Alma came out to meet him, and Henry followed at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough to allow the conversation to happen. Harlan introduced himself pleasantly, as if they had not been in a protracted conflict for 2 years. "Mrs. Alden," he said, "I believe we have allowed intermediaries to complicate what might have been a simpler conversation between 2 reasonable people. I wonder if you might give me 15 minutes. She looked at him with the measured calm she had applied to every difficult encounter Henry had witnessed. Then she opened the gate. They sat on the porch. Henry stood near the fence at an angle that gave him a clear line to the porch without being on it. Harlan glanced at him once, and then addressed himself entirely to Alma. His offer, when it came, was better than anything he had previously proposed. Not dramatically, extravagantly better, but meaningfully better, in a way that suggested he had actually thought about what would constitute a serious proposal to a serious person. The price was fair market value. The payment terms were immediate. He included a right of first option on the property for 10 years if Alma ever wished to purchase it back. It was a genuine offer, and Henry watched Alma hear it as such. When Harlan finished, Alma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Harlan, this is a fair offer. I appreciate that you made it. My answer is no." He tilted his head slightly. "May I ask why?" "Because this land belonged to my husband and it belongs to me, and what you want it for is to control the water supply to 3 properties to the south, which would put those families in an indefensible position." She said it with perfect courtesy. "Even if your offer were entirely without those implications, I would not sell. This is my home." Harlan looked at her for a long moment, and Henry watched the calculation behind those polished eyes. Then Harlan said, "I respect your position, Mrs. Alden." And he said it in the way of a man who does not respect it at all, but has decided that the cost of continuing to press it has become too high. He left. He rode back down the road without looking back. Alma sat on the porch for a while after he left, not moving, not speaking. Henry came and sat on the steps without asking, which he had never done before, and the fact that she did not object was its own kind of statement. "Do you think he will stop?" she asked. "For now," Henry said. "The angle he was working is closed." He might find another one eventually, but it will take time, and by then you will have more allies in the region, and the effort will not be worth it to him." She nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, "Thank you, Henry." He did not say "you are welcome" because that seemed inadequate. He said, "How is your garden doing? You mentioned last week the tomatoes were struggling." She looked at him sideways with an expression of great composure that barely concealed something warmer. "The tomatoes are struggling," she confirmed. "I think they need more water at the base." "I can fix that," he said. "I know you can," she said. They sat on the porch in the late afternoon sun, and the crisis that had brought them here was not over precisely, because crises like this rarely concluded cleanly, but its most dangerous phase had passed, and what remained in its wake was something quieter and more precious: the ordinary peace of a day's work done and the prospect of another day ahead. The weeks that followed were the most quietly remarkable of Henry Dawson's life. He stayed. He did not write to Tucson to decline the job, and then the passage of time made the decision for him, and he did not regret it. He worked the property with the same diligence he had applied since the beginning, but it was a different kind of work now, because it was his work, in the sense of something he was invested in genuinely, not just practically. He fixed the irrigation channels properly, improving on what Thomas had built with the knowledge he had accumulated over 15 years of moving through the West. He helped Alma bring 3 new calves through a difficult patch in midsummer. He built a proper cold storage cellar that the property had needed for years, and in the evenings on the porch they talked. The talking was what did it, Henry thought later. Not the dramatic moments, not the confrontations at the gate or the crisis of the summons or Harlan's visit. Those were the things that had shown them who the other person was under pressure, which mattered. But the talking was the thing that built whatever was building between them, slowly and with great care, the way you build something you mean to last. She told him about growing up in Illinois, the daughter of a schoolteacher, which explained the precision and intellectual rigor she brought to every situation. She told him about meeting Thomas at 19 and the journey west and the first winter on the claim, which had been very hard, and how they had survived it through a combination of Thomas's unshakable good humor and her own refusal to accept defeat. She told him about the 11 days of Thomas's illness, and this she told without breaking, but with a directness that was clearly costing her something. "I miss him," she said. "That is not a statement about the present or the future. It is simply a true fact that will always be true." "I know," Henry said. And he did know, and he did not try to compete with or minimize it, because the grief of a good marriage was its own thing and it deserved respect. She told him on a different evening that she was 31 years old, and that she had spent the 2 years since Thomas's death being so focused on survival that she had not allowed herself to think about anything beyond survival. "And now?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Now I am thinking about things beyond survival," she said. He let this sit for a moment. Then, carefully, "So am I." She leaned over and rested her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment, and the desert was very quiet around them. Then she sat up straight again and suggested they should probably go to sleep because the cattle needed checking early in the morning. He agreed and went to the bunkhouse and lay on his back in the dark with his hands behind his head and thought that he had not been this close to happiness in so long that it felt like a country he had visited once as a child and thought he would never find again. He moved out of the bunkhouse in September. It was not a dramatic transition. Alma simply said one evening, with the matter-of-fact pragmatism that characterized her approach to everything, that it was getting cold enough at night that the bunkhouse was going to become uncomfortable, and that she had a proper guest room that was standing empty, and there was no sensible reason for him to sleep in a cold building when there was a warm one available. He accepted this with equivalent practicality, and they both understood that the practicality was genuine and was also not the entire story. He asked her to marry him in October, under the big cottonwood tree at the northern end of the property, where the creek made a particular sound over the stones that was peaceful in a way Henry had never found anything else peaceful. He asked her without artifice or performance, plainly and honestly, saying that he wanted to spend his life here and wanted to spend it with her, and that he understood if she needed more time and was asking now because he knew his own mind and believed she knew hers. She said yes. She said it with the characteristic Alma Alden combination of complete composure and profound sincerity that somehow conveyed more feeling than the most elaborate declaration could have managed. Then she said, "I should tell Tom Garrett. He will be insufferably pleased with himself." Henry laughed, and she smiled fully for the first time he had seen, and it rearranged everything in his chest that had already been significantly rearranged. They were married in November 1877 in the Ridgeline Church by the Methodist minister who had known Thomas Alden and who performed the service with the appropriate recognition that this was a second chapter and not a replacement of the first. Tom Garrett attended and was, as predicted, insufferably pleased with himself. The Ray's family came, including Miguel, who shook Henry's hand with the firm grip of someone communicating respect. Senora Vargas attended and cried, which she maintained afterward had been about the ceremony and not at all about personal feelings regarding the situation. Sheriff Orrell came to the reception, which surprised Henry, and presented them with a jar of preserved peaches and the information that Preston Harlan had announced his intention to sell the Ridgeline Bank and relocate to California, citing a desire to explore opportunities on the Pacific coast. Orrell said this with the careful neutrality of a man who had not missed the connection, but was not going to speak it aloud. Henry shook Orrell's hand. They spent their first winter together on the property, and it was a winter that had its difficulties, because two people who have each spent a long time being entirely self-sufficient have to learn the particular art of sharing space and decisions. And both Henry and Alma were people of strong opinions and deeply established habits. There were arguments, real ones, not the dramatic confrontational kind, but the quieter, more stubborn kind that come from two people each being certain they are right about something practical. The first serious one was about the cattle operation. Henry wanted to expand the herd in the spring, seeing an opportunity in the market shift happening as the railroad continued its expansion into Arizona territory. Alma wanted to consolidate and improve what they had, arguing that expansion without sufficient infrastructure was a trap. They argued about this for 3 evenings. Alma won because she was right, and Henry said so, which she acknowledged by adapting his expansion proposal into a 2-year plan that incorporated the infrastructure development she had correctly identified as prerequisite, and the result was better than either of their original positions. This, they later agreed, was the essential pattern of their marriage. Henry wrote to his family in East Texas in January, the first contact he had initiated in several years. He told them he was married and settled, because those were the facts they would care about most. His brother James wrote back within 6 weeks, a surprisingly warm letter that contained no recriminations and ended with an invitation to visit. Henry read the letter 3 times and told Alma about it that evening, and she said they should visit in the summer, which had not occurred to him as a real possibility until she said it. Preston Harlan's departure from Ridgeline became official in February, when the bank was sold to a consortium from Tucson that included Robert Finch among its principals, a fact that gave Alma a particular satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. The new ownership reviewed all outstanding loan accounts and corrected several that had been managed in what Finch diplomatically described as a non-standard manner. Alma's account was formally closed with a letter of commendation for consistent payment, which she framed and hung in the kitchen in a gesture that was both entirely ironic and entirely sincere. Spring came in with a rush of color across the high desert, the kind of spring that reminds you why people chose to live in hard places, and with it came the confirmation that Alma was expecting a child. She told Henry in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, with the directness that characterized her approach to everything significant. He had been pouring coffee, and he set the pot down very carefully and then stood completely still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her, which he did not do without her permission, but which she allowed and then returned, and they stood together in the kitchen in the morning light for a long moment without speaking. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Considerably," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said. She laughed, which was also something that had come more frequently in the months since their marriage, and rested her forehead briefly against his. "Good. It would be alarming to face this alone." "You will not face anything alone again," he said, and he meant it in the simple, declarative way he meant everything. "I know that," she said. They wrote to his family in Texas and to her family in Illinois, and there were letters of congratulation from both, and Tom Garrett appeared at the property the next day, having somehow received the information through channels that remained mysterious, and was, this time, entirely sweet about it rather than insufferable. The summer of 1878 was full and complicated and beautiful. They made the trip to East Texas in June, a journey of 10 days, and Henry's reunion with his brothers was awkward in the way that reunions after 15 years of distance inevitably are, full of the weight of unspoken things and the simultaneous effort to not speak all of them at once. But his mother was alive and well and immediately fell in love with Alma, which Henry had somehow known would happen, and by the end of the visit his brother James had said quietly to Henry that he was glad he had come back. "I am not entirely back," Henry said. "Arizona is home." James looked at him with the evaluating gaze of an older brother who has known you your whole life. "You look like a man who knows where he is," he said. "That is enough." The Alden-Dawson property, as it had come to be known in the county, expanded according to the 2-year plan Alma had laid out. By summer's end they had brought on 2 hired hands, brothers named Ernesto and Domingo Chavez, from a family that had been in the territory for 2 generations, both hardworking and reliable and increasingly indispensable. The cattle operation grew modestly and well. The creek channels were improved to the point where they became a model that other property owners in the area consulted about. Tom Garrett died in July, peacefully in his sleep at 73, leaving his property to his nephew in New Mexico, but leaving Henry and Alma a letter that his lawyer delivered that said, in part, that watching them build something together had been the finest entertainment of his final years, and that he was grateful to them for it. Alma kept the letter with the letter from the bank. Their son was born in September 1878, healthy and loud, and arriving in the world with a declaration of his opinions that Henry recognized from the first moment as entirely Alma's. They named him Thomas James Dawson, the first name for the man who had built the property and the second for Henry's brother, a combination that Alma proposed and Henry accepted with a feeling he was not equipped to put into words. He was the kind of father that Henry had not known he would be, present and steady, and enormously interested in everything about the small person who had arrived in their lives. He learned the particular skill of working with an infant strapped to his chest in a sling that Senora Vargas made for them, which allowed him to continue doing necessary work while Tommy slept against the warmth of him. Alma watched this and said nothing for several weeks. Then she said one evening that she had not expected this from him, and that she should have, and that it was one of the several things she was wrong about when she thought she knew what she was getting. "What did you think you were getting?" he asked. "A man who would be competent at emergencies and uncomfortable at ordinary life," she said. "You are extremely comfortable in ordinary life." "I was not always," he said. "I needed someone to teach me what ordinary life looked like worth having." She looked at him across the kitchen table with Tommy between them on the floor, batting at a wooden toy that Ernesto had carved for him, and the look on her face was not the composed, measuring look he had first known her by. It was open and warm and entirely present, the face of a woman who had arrived somewhere she intended to stay. "You are going to make me cry," she said. "You never cry," he said. "I have been considering revising that policy," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him have it with the ease of someone who had stopped counting the cost of such gestures, because the cost had become something she was glad to pay. The years that followed were good years. They were not without difficulty, because the West in the late 1870s and into the 1880s was still a territory in the process of defining itself, and that process was not gentle. The Apache conflicts in the southern part of the territory cast a shadow over everyone's lives, and Henry and Alma were both people who understood that the history being made around them was not simple or clean, that the land they lived on had a history that preceded them, and had been taken at a cost they had not paid but were benefiting from. They talked about this honestly, which was not comfortable. They treated the people around them with the equity that the situation demanded, which was at least something. In 1880, the railroad reached closer to Ridgeline, and the town changed the way towns change when the railroad arrives, with an influx of new people and new commerce and new tensions. Henry served briefly as a deputy sheriff when Orrell retired, because the new sheriff was young and the county had need of steady experience, and he did this for 18 months before concluding that his primary obligation was to his family and his property and returning to both full-time. Their second child arrived in 1881, a daughter they named Rose Elizabeth, who came into the world with the same declarative confidence as her brother and who, by the age of 2, had learned to manage her parents with an efficiency that Henry found both alarming and deeply admirable. "She gets that from you," he told Alma. "She absolutely does," Alma agreed, with no trace of apology. Tommy, at 3, was all action and investigation, the kind of child who needed to understand how everything worked, which led to the disassembly of several items around the property that were not improved by the process. Henry let him help with small practical tasks, finding that the best way to manage the investigation instinct was to give it useful direction. They expanded the house in 1882, adding 2 rooms to accommodate the growing family and the increasing frequency of guests, because Alma had developed a hospitality instinct that she had not known she possessed until she had the property secured enough to indulge it. Senora Vargas came for a week in the spring and stayed a month. Robert Finch came twice yearly, now a genuine friend rather than simply an attorney. Miguel Reyes married a woman from Tucson named Catalina, and they came to dinner often. Henry wrote to his family in Texas regularly, which he had not done in the 15 years before his marriage, and which he now understood had been a deprivation he had not recognized as such. His mother visited in 1883, making the journey with his brother James and James's wife, a trip that Henry had arranged with considerable effort, and that resulted in a 2-week visit that was the best 2 weeks of his childhood home being transplanted to his adult one, his mother in Alma's kitchen being somehow exactly right. His mother told him privately on the last evening before she left that she had worried about him for 15 years and had not been wrong to worry, and that she was no longer worried. "She is a remarkable woman," she said, meaning Alma. "Yes," Henry said. "You are good to her," his mother said. "That is the important thing." He thought about this for a long time after she left. He thought about what being good to someone meant in practice, day after day, in the accumulated weight of ordinary time. He thought that the answer was simpler than he had once believed. It meant showing up completely, with everything you had, and meaning it. By 1884, the Alden-Dawson property was one of the more prosperous small operations in the county. Not dramatically, not the kind of wealth that changed who you were or how you moved through the world, but the solid, reliable prosperity of something built carefully and maintained well. The 2 creek channels that Harlan had once coveted fed water to the property, and its neighbors in an arrangement that Alma had formalized into a cooperative agreement that 3 other families had joined, ensuring that no single landowner could monopolize the water supply. This arrangement, which was called the Ridgeline Water Cooperative in the county records, became something of a model in the region. One evening in the fall of 1884, Henry sat on the porch in the dusk and watched Alma help Tommy with something at the far end of the yard. The two of them bent over something on the ground, their heads together, and Rose was chasing something in the grass with the absolute focused commitment of a 3-year-old in pursuit of a grasshopper, and the particular quality of the light at that moment, the copper and rose of a desert sunset that turned everything it touched into something from a painting, fell across the whole scene with a generosity he felt almost like a physical thing. Alma looked up and saw him watching and straightened up and walked toward the porch alone, her dark hair now showing a thread or two of silver at the temples that she had not yet decided to regard as anything other than interesting. She sat on the step beside him, which was not how they usually sat, and leaned her shoulder against his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, sorting through the accurate answer. "I am thinking about a road outside Ridgeline," he said. "About sitting on a horse in the evening light and making a decision." She was quiet. "I turned around," he said. "I know," she said. "I did not know what I was turning back toward," he said. "I just knew I could not go forward." She rested her head against his shoulder, the way she had that first time on the porch, except that now it was not a brief gesture of vulnerability but a settled thing, a natural configuration of two people who had long since found their arrangement. "I am glad you turned around," she said. "So am I," he said. Tommy appeared at the end of the yard holding up whatever they had been examining, calling for his mother's attention, with the insistence of a 7-year-old who has found something important. Rose abandoned the grasshopper and came at a run in the same direction, because whatever her brother had was automatically more interesting than whatever she had. Alma stood, and Henry stood with her, and they walked out together into the last of the sunset light where their children were waiting, and the creek made its particular sound over the stones at the north end of the property, and the stars were beginning to come out one by one over the red cliffs of the Arizona territory, and the world was exactly the right size. They built 3 more years together that were full of the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life being lived well. Rose grew out of her grasshopper phase and into a phase of asking questions at a rate that challenged even Alma's considerable capacity for explanation. Tommy decided at 8 that he was going to learn to read everything in the house and worked his way through every book and document available with the systematic thoroughness of his mother and the stubborn patience of his father. Henry taught both of them to ride, to his own great satisfaction, and Alma watched this process with a cup of coffee and an expression of affectionate amusement that he had come to treasure as one of the particular comforts of his life. In the spring of 1886, Alma confirmed a 3rd pregnancy, which delighted them both and which Tommy received with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had weighed the implications and found them acceptable, and which Rose received with the enthusiasm of someone who considered the arrival of another person into her orbit to be a generally good development. Their second son arrived in December 1886, healthy and already looking, Senora Vargas declared, exactly like his father. They named him William Henry Dawson, and he was from the first day a calm and watchful presence that Tommy found slightly disappointing in his failure to immediately be interesting. "Give him time," Henry told Tommy. "How much time?" Tommy asked. "A year approximately," Henry said. Tommy considered this with the pragmatic patience of a 9-year-old who has learned that his father's estimates are generally reliable. By 1887, the Arizona Territory was a different place than it had been 10 years before. The railroad had changed the rhythms of commerce and travel in ways that were still working themselves out. The Apache conflicts had been brought to a conclusion that was complex and costly and not clean, and the question of statehood was beginning to be seriously discussed. The Wild West of legend was already becoming the subject of dime novels and tall tales, even as the people who had actually lived it were still living in it. Henry Dawson had lived enough of it. He found that he did not miss the years of movement and uncertainty and morally ambiguous work, not even as an adventure, the way some men missed it, with a romantic attachment to danger. What he had found in Ridgeline, in this property with these people, was everything the years of movement had been, without his knowing it, moving toward. He told Alma this one night, simply and without drama, lying in the dark after William had been settled and the house had finally found its quiet. "I used to think that moving was the point," he said, "that the purpose of going from place to place was something I would find at the end of it. And," she said, "the purpose turned out not to be something you find at the end," he said. "It is something you build in the middle." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thomas used to say something like that a life is not what it turns into but what you make of it while you are in it." He honored the mention of Thomas with the quiet respect it deserved. "He was right," he said. "He was often right," she said. "He was also wrong sometimes, which was equally important. Nobody is always right." "You are sometimes wrong," Henry said, with the specific mild tone that indicated this was a gentle observation and not a complaint. "Occasionally," she said, "about some things. The tomatoes," he said. She made a small sound. "The tomatoes needed the water at the base. I was right about the tomatoes." "You were absolutely right about the tomatoes," he agreed. "I was thinking of the argument about the Dodd fence line." "That argument is still in progress," she said firmly. He laughed quietly, and she laughed too, and the house was warm and the children were asleep, and the creak could be heard faintly through the window. And Henry Dawson lay in the dark with his wife beside him, and felt the completeness of the thing he had built, not by himself, but with her, from the raw material of accident and courage, and the kind of obstinate faith that keeps a person going toward something good even when they cannot see it clearly. The seasons turned. Tommy grew into a young man of 15, with his mother's mind and his father's steadiness, already talking about the law with the serious intent of someone who has decided early what their purpose is. Rose at 12 was all energy and argument, beautiful and sharp and entirely herself, interested in everything from the cattle operation to the stars visible from the porch roof, where she was theoretically not allowed but practically tolerated. William at 4 was the quiet heart of the family, deeply attached to animals and to the specific daily routines of the property, in a way that suggested he was going to spend his life in exactly this kind of place, which did not disappoint his parents in the slightest. Alma at 42 was the person Henry admired most in the world, a fact that did not diminish with familiarity, but rather increased with it, as admiration tends to do when it is based on genuine knowledge rather than projection. She had grown into her own authority in the county in ways that sometimes surprised her, asked to advise on water disputes and land agreements because her reputation for fairness and precision was widely understood. She did this work carefully and without seeking it, which was probably why it kept finding her. On an October morning in 1889, the morning after Arizona Territory's renewed push for statehood made the front page of the Tucson newspaper that arrived in Ridgeline by rail, Henry walked out to the gate at the front of the property as he did most mornings, checking the fencing and the road and the general condition of the land, with the eyes of a man who knows every inch of something he has spent 12 years building. He stood at the gate in the early morning light, the same gate where, 12 years before, he had made a declaration that had changed both their lives. The gate had been rebuilt since then, sturdier and better hung, though he remembered the original quite precisely. Alma came out with coffee and joined him at the gate, which she occasionally did when the morning was clear enough to make the walk worthwhile. She stood beside him looking out at the road and the scrubland and the distant red line of the cliffs. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, handing him the coffee. He thought about 3 riders on a dusty road. He thought about a declaration made to keep something precious from being taken. He thought about turning around on a road to Tucson when the sun was going down and something in him refused to keep moving. "This gate," he said. She looked at him. She knew the story, every part of it, because they did not have secrets from each other. They had simply decided years ago that honesty was worth more than comfort. "You were very impressive," she said. "I was terrified," he said. "Those things are not incompatible," she said. He looked at her in the morning light and felt the simple, vast, uncomplicated gratitude of a man who knows exactly where he is and is exactly where he intends to be. "No," he agreed. "They are not." She leaned her shoulder against his, and they stood at the gate of their property in the October light, with the coffee steaming between them and the sound of their children, somewhere behind the house beginning their morning, Tommy's voice and Rose's higher answer, and somewhere the particular contented sounds of William examining something on the ground. And the Arizona sky above all of it was the absolute, clear blue of a world that was going on being itself with or without anyone's permission. Indifferent and beautiful and vast. Henry put his arm around Alma's shoulders and she let him, and they stood that way for a while, watching the road. No riders came. There was nothing to defend against this morning. There was only the gate and the road and the land behind them that they had built and kept and would keep building, and the long, unbroken good of what they had made together out of a chance turning, and a stubborn woman on a porch who had not asked for help but had been willing, eventually, to accept it. He pressed his lips to the top of her head briefly, and she made the small sound she made when something was exactly what she needed, and she was not going to comment on it. The morning kept going. There were cattle to check, and a fence section that Tommy had reported needed attention and breakfast to make and William to chase, because he had disappeared in the direction of the barn, with the focused intentionality of a 4-year-old who has a plan. There was a letter to write to Robert Finch about the cooperative's expansion, and a seed order to review before the end of the month. There was everything that a life, built day by day with care and love and honest work, contains. Henry Dawson walked back through his gate and toward his home, and the gate swung closed behind him with the solid, settled sound of something that was exactly where it was meant to be, and he did not look back at the road. He had no reason to look back. Everything worth having was ahead of him.